Hi everyone, my name is Eekhof and today I'm presenting my research on engagement with narrative characters. Let's first talk a bit about what character engagement is. Broadly defined, character engagement is the process of cognitively and emotionally engaging with the minds of narrative characters. Previous research has identified various experiences and processes that fall under the broader umbrella of character engagement. And these terms will be very familiar to you. They include things like identification, wanting to be like a character, narrative empathy, liking, sympathy, care, or more negative experiences such as personal distress or aversion. Now, I'm not going to attempt to summarize all of the research out there on these individual processes, but instead I would like to draw your attention to pluralist accounts that have attempted to combine these various terms into an overarching theory of character engagement. And according to these accounts, character engagement is highly dynamic, both in terms of the intensity, the frequency, as well as the target of readers' character engagement, and it depends on various psychological processes that readers can move in and out of. Leaving the theoretical discussion aside, character engagement is an important aspect of what makes narrative reading unique and fun, and it has been the focus of many empirical studies. When and why do readers experience character engagement? Various studies have looked at both reader and textual determinants for these experiences. For example, some research has found that readers who report greater empathic tendencies in daily life usually also experience more sympathy, empathy, and concern for fictional characters, as well as more identification with these characters. Other researchers have looked at the side of the text. For example, research on content-related aspects of narrative has found that both the topic of a story as well as the character traits of its protagonists affect character engagement. Even more research has looked at form-related aspects, in particular related to perspectivization techniques. For example, it has been argued that a first-person perspective would be more conducive for character engagement because the story is told from the perspective of the experiencing character. But results from empirical studies looking at the effects of a global manipulation of grammatical perspective are a bit mixed. Taking a slightly different approach, other researchers have looked at more local perspective effects and found that, for example, identification is usually higher for the character from whose perspective a story is told, and that giving readers access to the inner worlds of characters, for example, through thought representation or narration techniques, often, but not always, lead to increased character engagement. In more recent years, there has been a call to not only look at these textual and reader characteristics in isolation, but also to see how text and reader interact to create character engagement experiences. And that's what we've done in our study. Specifically, in this study, we looked at how the presence of perceptual, cognitive, and emotional viewpoint markers, and these are content words that give readers access to the inner worlds of characters, as well as a wide range of social cognitive abilities, interact to create character engagement experiences. And I'll go into more detail of both these textual characteristics and reader characteristics when I introduce our method. Our research question was as follows. How do the presence or absence of narrative viewpoint markers and reader social cognitive abilities interact to create experiences of character engagement? And we had three hypotheses. Firstly, we expected that texts that are rich in viewpoint markers would lead to higher character engagement than texts that do not provide the readers with much explicit cues of characters' inner worlds. Secondly, we hypothesized that overall social cognitive abilities would facilitate character engagement. Thirdly, we expected an interaction between the textual and reader dimension, such that we expected a stronger effect of social cognitive abilities in texts that lacked viewpoint markers. And let me explain why that is. Based on earlier findings from an eye tracking study, We theorized that readers can use two sources of information to make sense of the inner worlds of characters. First of all, the text that might provide them with clues about what a character thinks, feels, or experiences. And secondly, their own social cognitive abilities that they can use to make sense of the way a character behaves and what that says about their thoughts, feelings, and experiences. We hypothesized that there would be a sort of trade-off between these two sources of information. So on the one hand, when textual cues are present, all readers can mostly rely on those textual cues. But when the text does not provide a lot of explicit information about the characters' minds, then readers can only rely on their own ability to reason about and share in the characters' experiences. So in those cases, we expected the effect of social cognitive abilities on character engagement to show up more prominently. So let's have a look at the method of our study, starting with the text that we used. We used a very controlled manipulation technique to be able to isolate the effects of the presence or absence of viewpoint markers. Let me know if you want to know more about the specific details of this procedure, but for now, I'll mostly just show you the results. We started out with two existing Dutch short literary stories, and for the impoverished viewpoint condition, we basically removed all viewpoint markers and thought reports except when they were embedded in speech reports. This led to very low percentages of perceptual, cognitive, and emotional viewpoint markers, and as you can see, a text that mostly reports about actions. For the enriched viewpoint condition, we took the original text and then doubled the original numbers of perceptual viewpoint markers, which are marked in blue here, cognitive viewpoint markers, which are marked in green, and emotional viewpoint markers marked in yellow. And this led to higher percentages of these respective viewpoint marker categories and a text that reports both on the outer and inner world of the character. Both texts were around 700 to 1,000 words in the original conditions, and the enriched viewpoint condition was slightly longer after the manipulation than the impoverished viewpoint condition. We recruited participants from Prolific, 349 native speakers of Dutch. We showed them our text, so they read both texts, one in the enriched viewpoint condition and one in the impoverished viewpoint condition. We used various measures of social cognition, two self-report skills, the IRI and the basic empathy scale, as well as the multifaceted empathy test, which is a more performance-based measure of affective empathy, and the spontaneous theory of mind protocol, which is a very nice task, but we didn't find any effect, so I won't go into details of how it works. And half of the participants completed these measures at the start of the experiment and the other half at the end. And then to measure character engagement, we used various items from various scales. The EDI scale by Igor. We used items that were originally developed for the empathy and perspective taking subscales of the narrative engagement scale, and then we used the comprehensive state empathy scale. And what we did is we used all of these items and then we entered them in a PCA to see whether we could extract underlying components. Going on to the results, let's first look at the principal component analysis. We were able to extract 6 different components from all of these character engagement items we administered. The cognitive perspective taking component contained items like, I understood the reasons why the characters did what they did. The empathic imagination component contained items like, I found myself trying to imagine what X was experiencing. The personal distress component contained items like, I felt distressed or disturbed in response to X's story. The identification subscale contained items like, I felt as if I formed part of the story. The sympathy component contained items like, I felt soft-hearted or tender in response to X's story. And finally, the motivation to help component contained items like, I found myself thinking about what could be done to help X. We also found that all of these components were positively correlated. supporting the idea that character engagement is highly dynamic and that readers can experience, for example, sympathy and personal distress within the same reading session. We then analyzed these components and the way they were affected by both our viewpoint manipulation as well as readers' social cognitive abilities using linear mixed models. Unfortunately, we were only able to analyze 4 of the components due to some model fitting difficulties. Important to mention, we also controlled for readers' print exposure as well as fiction reading habits. Let's first look at the effects of social cognitive abilities on these 4 dimensions of character engagement. So first of all, we found that the effective empathy subscale of the basic empathy scale positively affected readers' personal distress and identification. This can also be seen in these plots. So on the x-axis, we have the effective empathy scores from the basic empathy scale. And then on the y-axis, we have these 2 dimensions of character engagement, story-induced personal distress, and identification. Each dot represents a single story as read by a single participant, with blue dots marking enriched viewpoint condition and yellow for the impoverished viewpoint condition. And then on the right here we have plots of the predicted values based on the linear mixed models. We also found positive effects of the fantasy subscale of the IRI, which reflects the tendency to become immersed in fictional others. So it's strictly speaking not really a measure of social cognition, you could argue, but it had positive effects on empathic imagination and identification, which can also be seen in these plots. Then we found positive effect of the perspective-taking subscale of the IRI on empathic imagination, as well as positive effects of the emotional empathy measure that was more performance-based on all 4 components, which can also be seen in these plots. Then, somewhat surprisingly, we found negative effects of some of these measures of social cognitive abilities as well. So the cognitive empathy subscale of the basic empathy scale had negative effects on identification and sympathy. So what this suggests is that people who take a more kind of rational approach to understanding others in daily life experience less identification and sympathy for characters when they are reading. And then similarly, we also found a negative effect of the personal distress subscale, not to be confused with the personal distress component. So this is really people's daily stable tendency to feel panic or disturbance in emotional situation, and that negatively influenced sympathy. Then let's look at the effects of our manipulation. So we only found an effect of the manipulation for the empathic imagination component, where, as expected, we found that empathic imagination was higher when viewpoint markers were present compared to when they were not present. But quite unexpectedly, no effects for the other 3 components. And here's a violin and box plot for the effect of the textual manipulation, with the enriched viewpoint condition on the left and the impoverished viewpoint condition on the right. And then we also only found one interaction effect for the sympathy component, where we found that the effect of the perspective-taking subscale of the IRI was stronger in the enriched viewpoint condition compared to the impoverished viewpoint condition. So contrary to our expectations, the perspective-taking subscale was more important, had a stronger effect when viewpoint markers were present compared to when they were not present. So this was contrary to our expectations, and moreover, we only found one interaction effect for one component for one specific social cognitive ability. So here's a summary of all of our findings. As you can see, social cognitive abilities in general had a positive effect, but not all of them did. Some had negative effects. And I think we can also conclude from this figure that affective and emotional empathy seem to be the most important drivers of character engagement. And then the textual manipulation had a very small effect, and we really barely found any evidence for an interplay between the textual and reader dimensions. So to conclude, we found evidence that character engagement is multidimensional and highly dynamic. We also found that it is mainly and in various ways affected by readers' social cognitive abilities. So again, we found overall positive effects of affective or emotional empathy, and then we found more local positive effects of perspective taking and fantasy, and quite surprisingly, also local negative effects of cognitive empathy and personal distress. We found limited evidence for the effect of the presence of viewpoint markers, so again, only for empathic imagination, but it's important to note that we measured character engagement quantitatively in this study, so perhaps it could be interesting to look at the effect of these kind of textual manipulations on more qualitative measures, perhaps, for example, readers' interpretations of characters' thoughts and feelings are more homogeneous, when they are measured qualitatively and the viewpoint markers are present, whereas they arrive at more ambiguous or heterogeneous interpretations when they really can only rely on their own inferences. And then finally, we found limited evidence for an interplay between social cognitive abilities and the presence of these viewpoint markers. It should be noted that we had a mostly neurotypical population. We had plenty of evidence that there were individual differences in social cognitive abilities, but perhaps when we really look at a wider range that also includes the very low end of the spectrum for social cognitive abilities, there could be an effect of this kind of interplay between those abilities and the presence of viewpoint markers. All right, thank you for listening to my presentation. In case your mind is already fully occupied with all the information from all the other presentations, I just want to send you off with one take-home message, which I think is the most interesting takeaway from our results, which is that readers first and foremost rely on the same emotional mechanisms they use to understand others in real life to engage with fictional others. Thank you very much, and just in case you're interested, here are the references for this presentation. Bye!